The Gospel according to John, chapter 19, verses 1 to 11. Then Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe, and said, Hail, King of the Jews! And they smote him with their hands. Pilate therefore went forth again, and saith unto them, Behold, I bring him forth to you, that ye may know that I find no fault in him. Then came Jesus forth, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate saith unto them, Behold the man. When the chief priests therefore and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. Pilate saith unto them, Take ye him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and by our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he was the more afraid, and went again into the judgment hall, and saith unto Jesus, Whence art thou? But Jesus gave him no answer. Then saith Pilate unto him, Speakest thou not unto me? Knowest thou not that I have power to crucify thee, and have power to release thee? Jesus answered, Thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. There endeth our reading. Thank you, Lord. Amen. This first reading from chapter 19 of the Gospel according to John, we continue to be witness to the extraordinarily tense and fraught exchange between Pontius Pilate, the procurator of Jerusalem on behalf of the Roman Empire, and the Jewish elite, the Sanhedrin, the high priest and chief priests. This occurring early in the morning on this fateful day, which will end, as we know, with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. In the final reading from chapter 18, we witnessed the attempts of Pontius Pilate to have Jesus essentially released, to dismiss the charges. He even tried to appeal to the Jewish elite to essentially allow him to forgive Jesus as the prisoner that they could have chosen at Passover to be released, but they instead cried that they wanted Barabbas released, and Barabbas was an insurrectionist and a murderer, choosing Barabbas over Jesus, who was entirely without sin, and who they knew in their hearts, some of them very sincerely knew to be the Messiah. So we begin then in chapter 19, continuing this witness with Pilate handing Jesus over to his soldiers to scourge him. And I've described this in some detail in previous readings of this part of the Passion of Christ. I will put links in the description below the video, taking you to the equivalent passages in Mark and Matthew. Suffice to say, scourging was not just a whipping, it was a flaying. It was a desperately torturous ordeal, sometimes ending in death for the poor person being scourged, being beaten for a long period, both with sharp canes and also with leather thongs that had bone and pieces of metal embedded in them, literally flaying the back of the person on the receiving end. We learn here also of the humiliation that Jesus underwent from the soldiers, there plaiting a crown of thorns, putting it on his head, this also indescribably painful, and also putting on him a purple robe. One commentator, the pulpit commentator, indicated that the thorns are thought to come from the species Lycium spinosum, which is a thorn that grows in that part of the world, flexible with long, painful thorns. The soldiers, and again the translation from the Greek would more naturally be, and they kept coming to him and saying, it's this present continuous tense, and they kept coming to him, or actually past continuous tense, they kept coming to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." So just mocking him because of the accusation that he claims to be a king. That's the interpretation they have of what the Jewish elite have said. And again we have this translation of hands being the objects of assault. As we learned a few readings ago when Jesus was struck by the officer in the palace of the high priest, the original Greek is better translated as rod, being struck with a rod. And this is then harmonious with the account in Matthew chapter 27, and this would be verse 29, 30, and reading as follows. And when they had plaited a crown of thorns, they put it upon his head, and a reed in his right hand. And they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And they spit upon him and took the reed and smote him on the head. And reed there being a cane, essentially. So even though we have this idea that they might be punching him or slapping him, it's more likely that they were beating him on the head, in fact, on that crown of thorns with canes. Violent, humiliating, extraordinarily painful. Now, we have to ask the question, what is the thinking of Pontius Pilate here? He has been seeking to have Jesus released because he finds in him no fault. But at the same time, he's handed him over for a trial of fire of treatment from some of the Roman soldiers, and now he's bringing Jesus forth again before the Jewish elders. And the thought of commentators is that he is seeking a middle ground here, that if he severely chastises this man, Jesus of Nazareth, and brings him forth, that he will mollify the Jewish elders and they will be disinterested in pursuing any further punishment. So he brings Jesus before them, saying, "I find no fault in him," and he's hoping for them to disperse. Jesus is brought before them wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, so mocked and humiliated, and we have this famous phrase from Pilate, "Ecce homo," behold the man. But it's to no avail. The Jewish elders know exactly what they're about. For months, possibly longer, they have sought to destroy Jesus of Nazareth, and they're not going to be deterred. They see Jesus, he will be in a dreadful state, he'll be covered in blood, probably shaking, because after that scourging, well, one can only imagine the state he's in, and probably barely able to stand. In readings of these scourgings, it's reported that often even strong individuals would actually would die under the treatment because of the severe pain and shock to the system and the excessive bleeding. They cry out, "Crucify him, crucify him." And again, the translation from the Greek would be more accurately given as loud, harsh cries. In loud, harsh cries, they said, crucify him, crucify him. They have a bloodlust that will not cease. Pilate here mocks them in return. There is no love lost between the Jewish elite and the Roman procurator. He mocks them. Well, you take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him, knowing full well they have no power. They have no ability legally to crucify him or even stone him. Now at this point there is a shift. The Jewish elite change tack because they've brought Jesus as a malefactor. They didn't want to provide any details as to the accusation, and ultimately they made the accusation that Jesus was a threat to Caesar. But now they change tack because Pontius Pilate, as the Roman governor, has perfect ability to discern whether Jesus of Nazareth is a threat to Caesar, and he finds him to be no threat. So the Jews instead indicate that there is a Jewish law that's been broken, and it's the law of blasphemy. We have a law, and by our law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. And whereas Pilate was thinking of the political aspects of possibly someone who claimed to be a king, now being described in a divine nature, we learn in verse 8 that Pilate was the more afraid. So possibly nervous and fearful that he may be dealing with someone with the blood of Jewish royalty from a political point of view, but now being told in this extraordinarily tense standoff where the Jewish elite is determined to have this man crucified. They're saying to him, he has to die because he claims to be the Son of God. Now, Pontius Pilate was not a Jew, he's already said that, but he would be a man who had spiritual beliefs. It was probably very rare for someone not to have spiritual beliefs in those times. His beliefs would originate in a Roman form, but he would be fearful when the divine is mentioned. And he approaches Jesus in a different mood, a different emotional state now. There is almost humility. He goes back into the praetorium, into the judgment hall. Jesus is brought in, and Pilate says to him, "Whence art thou? From what divine origin do you come from?" And it may be that just as Jesus had a clear divinity about him, we think of clearing the court of the Gentiles and the temple of the hustle and bustle of money changers and traders. We think of the band of soldiers and the officers falling down before him in Gethsemane just from his divine appearance. There's no doubt but that Pilate would sense that too, and now he is on full alert. Remember also that we know from Matthew that he would have heard from his wife that she's been dreaming about this man, this good man as she describes him, and that her husband should have nothing to do with him in terms of punishment. I think he's fearful in a genuine way, and he wants to know. He wants to know more. Whence art thou? But Jesus gives no reply. And the fact that Jesus gives no reply here has sparked a lot of discussion from commentators. There's no clear-cut answer that I can discern from the commentators. To be honest, that the best I've found is that they feel that giving no answer is the best answer. But they are surprised because Jesus often was asked questions for which a yes or a no or a straightforward answer would be improper, and yet he always finds a way to provide either teaching or illumination or revelation through a set of words. But here he does not answer. And my own sense of this, and it's something that the pulpit commentary does not agree with. They mention it as something which cannot be the case, but to my mind this might indeed be the case, that Jesus is going through the motions of misery here in order to take the sins of the world upon him through sacrifice. We know this. He has spoken of this for months to his disciples. And not that Jesus is choreographing these dreadful events, but he is obviously the focus, the focal point of these events. And Pontius Pilate, in different ways, has sought the release of Jesus from at least the capital punishment, and is fearful and questioning, almost becoming an earnest questioner of that truth. What is truth? And if Jesus were to give an answer, perhaps Pontius Pilate, through his free will, would seek further discussion with Jesus, would begin to honor him, and then in no way would allow him to be crucified. And thereby Jesus would not fulfill the commandment of his Father in terms of the end of his ministry. So strange as it may seem, it may be that no answer is really the only way for Jesus here to just cut off that line of questioning, to make it easier for Pilate to do the thing that is needed to end the ministry in the way that is prophesied both by ancient prophets but also by Jesus himself. These are very deep waters of the intersection, almost a collision, of prophecy and free will, something we have spoken about now and again in the Gospel year. But the ministry of Jesus, the earthly manifestation of Logos, to bring people to God, as Jesus said, to be lifted up and draw men to God through being lifted up, essentially has to end with his crucifixion in a public, despicable, historical way that will be the focal point of the veneration of Christ through his crucifixion and resurrection. And therefore, Judas Iscariot, Caiaphas, Pontius Pilate, these are instruments in this unfolding of prophecy. And to what degree are they exercising their free will, or to what degree are they in a channel that cannot be evaded? A channel in the sense of a course of action that has some degree of flexibility within which their free will can be exercised, but is ultimately leading to a set end point. Really fascinating questions. Pontius Pilate continues to try, "Speak you not unto me? Do you not know I have the power to crucify you, and I have the power to release you?" Just to say that in some of the early manuscripts, what are sometimes called the best manuscripts, felt to be more accurate, the order of release and crucify is actually reversed there. It would read, knowest thou not that I have power to release thee and have power to crucify thee? And the psychology of saying that and hearing that differ quite markedly. But in any case, we end today's reading in verse 11, which is indeed the end of the interview between Jesus and Pontius Pilate. Jesus says to him, "You could have no power at all against me except it were given you from above." Essentially saying that the actions of Pontius Pilate are ordained from a divine source. He doesn't specify, he doesn't say from my Father or from God. He's speaking to a Roman who will give sacrifices and worship the Roman gods, presumably. But from above is a universal phrase that everyone in the world understands from a divine source. And then this enigmatic final line, "Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin." The greater sin, implying that there is sin in the hands of Pontius Pilate. Perhaps sin in the chastisement of Jesus through the scourging. Perhaps sin in trying to find this middle road with the Jewish elite rather than simply dismissing the accusations, although who knows politically for Pontius Pilate, if he were to dismiss the Jewish elite, it could give rise to a constitutional crisis. Almost probably would, in fact, almost certainly would, because we know that there would be tremendous sway that could be brought to bear on Roman governors from the Jewish elite in appealing to Caesar. So there is sin in the hands of Pontius Pilate, but it's not the deepest sin, because he has made an earnest effort to understand this prisoner and to understand the motives of the Jewish elite, and indeed to free the prisoner, but he has failed. But who is the he referred to here? "Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin." If it were they, and I think I read in one commentary that they believed it should be translated as they, then it's obvious, it's the Jewish elite, it's the Sanhedrin. They are the truly evil party here because they know me to be the Messiah, and yet they wish to destroy me to maintain their own power. That is the deepest sin we can imagine. But the translation is he, and nearly all the commentaries I've read regard this as he. They think it cannot be Judas Iscariot, because Judas Iscariot did not deliver Christ to Pontius Pilate. He delivered Christ to the Sanhedrin. Therefore, they believe that he refers to Caiaphas. Although Caiaphas is, in a sense, he is the representative of the Jewish elite at this time. He is the high priest, but we know that's been a bit of a revolving door in these years. So I have to say that's never the sense that I've had of this line as a citizen, as a non-theologian reading this over the years. And in saying what I'm about to say, it will sound possibly heretical, and it's not in any way meant to be that way. It's more of just the expression of a feeling. I feel that this final line relates to the above, to the divine aspect. And therefore, one way to read this, and it's not straightforward, but it's the feeling that I've always had from this line, is that in some sense Jesus is indicating that if there were sin, it would be ascribed to the forces that have delivered Jesus to this point in his life, namely the prophecies. That's what's delivered Jesus to Pontius Pilate. That's what will drive him to the cross, to die as a sacrificial lamb for mankind, is the inexorable nature of his ministry that has to end that way. And therefore, in terms of actions that are sinful in the sense of leading to suffering, it's the nature of the prophecies that are sinful in that way. The reason this is contorted and complex is that in reality there is no sin, because it is divine and righteous, as ordained by the Godhead, by the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, that the ministry of Jesus Christ should end in this way for the good of mankind, to draw them to God. It is not sinful, but in the human understanding of sin, in these fraught final moments of this mockery of a trial, that is where the ostensible sin would lie, because Pilate actually has no power to alter these events, and he could only alter them if that were divinely willed, which it is not, in fact. So that's my rather painful attempt to give voice to my feelings about this final phrase without really being able to express it well in words. But it may well be that I am seeing ghosts here, and that he simply refers to Caiaphas, the high priest.